Welcome back to our series where we are looking back at the invention of photography and the stories of the people who helped make things happen. Last time, we gave some background about photography as a whole and what it was like to live in the 1820s. In this episode, we're going to review the groundwork that was laid as the quest to develop photography had its humble beginnings 2,000 years prior to an image being successfully recorded and fixed. Not surprisingly, the origins of our journey to record images can be traced back to the Warring States period of the Zhou dynasty and a Chinese carpenter and philosopher named Mo Tzu, who was also known as Mozi. He was said to be an expert on fortification, which made him in demand by various rulers. Both his technical and philosophical writings were studied by his followers. He documented that when light from an object passed through a pinhole and into a dark room, an inverted and reversed image of the object was projected onto a wall or other surface. This pinhole image, as it is known as, can also be created using a box or a tent. The Greek philosopher Aristotle noticed the same phenomenon and realized that a partial eclipse of the sun could be studied by looking at the ground. The gaps between the leaves projected what was happening and allowed him to view the eclipse safely. Today, this phenomenon is still used to create images recorded by pinhole cameras. This diagram of camera obscura shows the principle of how it works. Light reflecting from an object passes through a very small opening and is then inverted and projected onto the back of the box. The distance the back is from the opening determines how large and how bright the image will appear. In the beginning of the Middle Ages, a medieval Arabic scientist from what is now Iraq did some groundbreaking work in the field of optics and lenses. Known as the father of modern optics, Abdu Ali al-Hassan ibn al-Haytham was the first person to correctly explain the theory of vision. Light reflects off an object, then passes through one's eyes. The brain then subjectively interprets these stimuli. He also observed that a glass sphere changed how objects looked when viewed through it. Over the course of 10 years, Al-Haytham wrote a 7-volume treatise called The Book of Optics. Almost 300 years later, it was translated from Arabic into Latin, and at the end of the 14th century, it was translated into Italian. His research and writings were so good that even 600 years after being written, giants of the scientific revolution like Newton, Kepler, Galileo, and Huygens frequently cited the Book of Optics. This was the foundation for developments in optics and lenses. We get introduced to our first of several polymath individuals, who are also known as a Renaissance man, someone who had broad talents and expertise in a number of different areas. Giovanni Battista della Porta was an Italian scholar and nobleman, as well as the founder of one of the first scientific societies called Accademia dei Segreti, members of which were called the OCOs. Because he was into things like the occult, alchemy, and astrology, among other things, he was often referred to as the Professor of Secrets. He found time between making advances in hydraulics, military engineering, pharmacology, and other things when, in 1553, he was credited with perfecting the camera obscura using a convex lens which was similar to the human eye. Later, he went on to develop the first telescope, but died before finishing the treatise to support his claim. While also being a Catholic, like Galileo after him, he did face an inquisition with the Pope, Gregory XIII, and had to disband his society because they were suspected of dealings in the occult. Also, while he had friends who were imprisoned, he invented a method to write secret messages on the inside of some eggs, which were not checked going into the prison. Boiling the egg before being transported washed away the ink on the outside, but the message was clearly visible on the egg white on the inside. With Johann Schulz, our second polymath individual in this story, we start to get somewhere with the whole possibility of recording an image, along with some broadening definitions in order to attempt to take credit for being the first at something. In 1717, Schulz found that when metallic silver was dissolved in a slurry of chalk and nitric acid, that The slurry darkened when exposed to light, but not when exposed to heat. He put the slurry into a bottle and applied stencils of words on the outside, then exposed it to light. The words persisted as long as the mask was in place and the bottle was undisturbed. As soon as the bottle was shaken or the stencil removed, the writing went away. Schulz was unable to make the image permanent and thus set up the quintessential problem that remained unsolved for the next 120 years. Because of this discovery, though, some German sources credit Schulz as being the inventor of photography. Of course they do. Schulz did unlock the key of using silver compounds, specifically silver nitrate, to record an image, and he teed up the challenge for others to take up the mantle. But what else was happening around the globe in the meantime? I've highlighted three things in particular that will have an effect on things as we get to the 1820s, which we discussed at the onset of this presentation. In 1800, Volta invented the first battery, and 5 years later, Volta's friend invented electroplating. Of course, Napoleon had the French at war with much of Europe and Russia. Put a pin in these things for the moment. These five people, who we will talk about next, continue to contribute and nudge us towards the end goal. Born in Prague and the oldest of 9 children, Johann Senefelder had to end his law scholarship in Munich when his father died in 1791 to support his mother and siblings. He became an actor and a playwright and even wrote a successful play. When another one of the plays that he wrote did not get printed in a timely manner due to printing problems, Senefelder fell into debt and was unable to print an additional play that he had written. Being unable to afford the engraved plates needed, Senefelder tried unsuccessfully to make his own plates. As fate would have it, a stroke of luck led to his discovery of the possibilities of using stone for a plate. He jotted down a list of things using a grease pencil on a piece of limestone. He then thought that if he etched away the non-image area, the markings would be left in relief. 2 years later, he had invented a new printing method, which would eventually become a dominant form of printing. As a playwright, he had a way with words, but his original name for the process was stone printing. The French word, lithography, was eventually adopted. This would become useful in the reproduction of both black and white as well as color images in the future. Right at the turn of the 19th century, things got kicked up a notch. English bachelor Thomas Wedgwood is credited with being the first person to reliably document his efforts using light-sensitive materials to make an image on paper and leather. He attempted to make images with the use of a camera obscura, however he was unsuccessful. He continued to work with the camera and was successful in recording silhouettes of objects that were placed in direct contact with the treated surfaces and exposed them to direct sunlight. The sunlit areas turned dark. Like Schulz before him, Wedgwood was unsuccessful in making the image permanent. Thomas suffered from a chronic stomach ailment that may have been genetic, as his nephew, Charles Darwin, had a similar affliction. I'll discuss this in a moment and why it is relevant. While Thomas did not overcome the lack of permanency other than to stick his images in pages of books, that didn't stop some historians from calling Wedgwood the first photographer. By a chance meeting at a pneumatic clinic in Bristol, which was treating him, Wedgwood met Sir Humphrey Davy, an English chemist and inventor. Davy supervised experiments related to the medical powers of some gases. The two became friends, and Davy, in 1802, wrote up Wedgwood's work and published it in London's Journal of the Royal Institution. This work directly influenced other chemists and scientists who were dabbling in the craft of photography. It was mentioned earlier that Volta had invented the battery in 1800. By 1802, Davy was in possession of one of the most powerful batteries of the time. With it, Davy was actually credited with creating the first incandescent light by passing electric current through a thin strip of platinum. He also used this battery to isolate a number of different elements and to determine the elemental nature of both chlorine and iodine, elements that will have significant importance in the not-too-distant future. Davy was not the only one who was making use of Alessandro Volta's invention. Luigi Valentino Brugnatelli, an Italian chemist and inventor, was a friend of Volta, and in 1801, the two of them went to Paris, France, to promote Volta's voltaic pile invention to the French Academy of Sciences. There was a competing theory concerning animal electricity, and many scientists in the Academy were skeptical and doubted Volta's explanation that electricity could be generated chemically rather than through biological organisms. Brugnatelli became collateral damage in this dispute as he was a friend of Volta. They went back to Italy and Luigi began his own experiments with the voltaic pile. In 1802, he successfully electroplated some carbon electrodes with gold. He spent the next 3 years refining his process and then went back to the French Academy of Sciences to present his work. Remember, at the time, Brugnatelli was an Italian chemist who was working under Napoleonic rule. The Academy prioritized French discoveries over others. This, along with Brugnatelli being Volta's friend, the Academy did not support Luigi's work and thus did not recognize it, effectively burying it for the next 30 years. Mamma mia! Bernard Courtois was a French chemist who was a contemporary of Sir Humphrey Davy. The two of them had been working on similar things. As mentioned, there was a significant conflict going on in Europe, namely the Napoleonic Wars. As a result of this, potassium nitrate, known as saltpeter, derived from wood ash and used in the manufacturing of gunpowder, was in short supply. Seaweed was looked as an alternative source of potassium nitrate because of its relative abundance. In 1811, Courtois was isolating sodium and potassium from seaweed ash, and he added some sulfuric acid. He had some corrosion of his copper vessels and was investigating when he noticed an unusual purple vapor being emitted. They condensed as crystals. Unfortunately, he did not take out what was known as a certificate of invention on his discovery, which would have netted him a small fortune instead of dying in 1838 nearly penniless. 11 years later, in 1822, he began manufacturing high-quality iodine and its salts. Now, despite the conflict between England and France, Davy did give credit to Courtois for the discovery of iodine, even though the two of them were working with the element at about the same time. Please join us the next time when we discover how a lack of drawing skills, a silver spoon, some mercury, and an antidote for cyanide poisoning result in an extraordinary gift to the world.